Hi everyone, I'm Seyeon Moon and I'm currently a senior here at Iolani, and my case symposium research was on the influence of culture on student social perceptions of other students and teachers. So we might all be familiar with the term RBF. It refers to someone's resting face that is non-smiling, and therefore in society we judge it as unfriendly, intimidating, unengaged, and overall bad. And this really stems down to two different things. First being that in Western culture, we value smiles a lot. And second are emotions. So there are two different types of emotions, ideal effect and actual effect. Ideal effect is the emotions that we want to feel. So perhaps after the long weekend, we want to feel happy and energetic. That's our ideal effect. And our actual effect is emotions that we're actually feeling. So maybe we're exhausted. That's our actual effect. And psychologists have differentiated our ideal effect, the emotions that we want to feel, into two different positive states. So of course, generally everyone wants to feel happy, but there's different definitions of happiness. First being our high arousal positive states. That's that surge of energy and excitement and that active emotion. So perhaps you might feel high arousal positive states when your favorite football team scores that winning touchdown. This is very different from our low arousal positives, which is more that calm, passive emotional state, which you might experience when you're doing yoga. And what's really interesting is that your preference between these two different types of emotions can be predicted by your cultural background. So European Americans are more likely to value high arousal positives more than low arousal positives compared to East Asians who value low arousal positives much more. And our preference between these two positives determine the people who we vote for, the people who we find attractive, activities we enjoy, and events that we're attracted to. So in the picture above, you'll see two different political leaders from two different countries. One being President Joe Biden. He's from a Western culture that values high arousal emotions. So therefore, he's going to have that open smile face to express friendliness, as opposed to the Chinese president, who is more reserved and more passive. Therefore, he's going to have that more calm, close smile. And so this led me to wonder if cultural differences is creating misperceptions in our school, with Iolani being such a diverse body with our boarding program. So I sent out a mass email to the junior and seniors class of Iolani and asked them several questions to help answer my research question. So the first study I looked at was the students' preferences between that low arousal positive emotions and the high arousal energetic emotions. So above, you'll see an example of one of our students' answers to the survey. They answered that they valued low arousal positives much less, which is in the yellow, as opposed to that high arousal positive, which is in the red. And with all the students, you could predict which one they valued more by their culture groups. So our European American students valued low arousal positive much less than our Asian student peers who valued it very highly. And interestingly, mixed students who were of Asian and European descent and Asian American students were pretty much in the middle between the two groups. And European American students valued high arousal value, that energetic emotional state, much more greater than Asian students who valued it much less. And the mixed students and the Asian American students were again in the middle. And the results of the Asian American and mixed students can be explained for various reasons, one being the fact that they're exposed to two different cultures simultaneously. So inside their home, they're constantly exposed to that East Asian culture, while outside of the home, they're exposed to the Western culture. The second study I looked at was the students' judgment on different types of faces that express different types of emotions. So I asked the students to judge the faces on the terms of friendliness, agreeableness, and extroversion, with 1 being the lowest and 5 being the highest. And that closed smile was more of that reserved, low arousal positive states, while the open, energetic smile was more of that high arousal positive states. And so the answers from the students differ depending on the racial background of the target groups. So for the European American faces, European American students value that high arousal, open wide smile much more friendlier than that low arousal passive smile. Again, mixed students and Asian American students were pretty much in between. They didn't show a strong preference of one over the other. And Asian students valued that closed smile much more than that open, energetic smile. But the answers are really quite different for the Asian faces. European Americans didn't show that drastic change and preference between the two, while they still showed a strong preference for the open wide smile. It wasn't as drastic as we've seen before. Mixed students and Asian American students, again, didn't show that great preference for one or the other. And for Asians, this time, they didn't show much of a preference. And this is something really interesting about how we decipher emotions depending on the target racial background. European Americans might be subconsciously aware that their fellow European American peers express friendliness in terms of smiles, but they also might be aware that Asian don't do the same. And that goes the same for the Asian students. They know that smiles does not play a huge role in determining someone's friendliness. And interestingly, agreeableness and extroversion didn't show a quite significant difference across the cultural groups. The last study I looked at was the students' preferences of class environments depending on their reflection of low arousal positive states and high arousal positive states. So I presented to the students 2 applicants. They were both applying for a teacher job here at Iolani. The first applicant reflected a much more low arousal positive teacher. She valued soothing and calming exercises and likes to do yoga before the start of class so that she can set peace. This was much different from our second applicant who liked that energetic, exciting class environment and likes to do outdoor and engaging activities. So the answers of the students much reflected their answers for their emotional values. European students did not value low arousal teachers as much as their Asian student peers. And again, mixed students and Asian Americans did not show strong preference of one over the other. On the other hand, European American students valued high arousal teacher environments much more greater, and Asian students valued it much more less. And again, mixed students and Asian American students did not show a great preference. So from the 3 different studies, we can conclude 3 different things. The first being that a student's cultural preference can determine their emotional value preference. Second is their cultural preference can determine how they perceive friendliness in different emotional expressions. And third, their cultural preference can determine which type of school environment they would like to be in. And so what do these significance all mean? Well, first we could start on our individual level. As you can see above, in the past data, students showed preference of one or the other. And this does not only apply to students, but anyone else as well. And it really goes to show that sometimes with the bias of our culture, we tend to value one more thing than the other, and we diminish the other as bad or just not as relevant. And this is where all the concept of FOMO, fear of missing out, comes from. In Western culture, we really value that spontaneous, energetic life that we see on Instagram and Facebook. But having the realization that low arousal, calming environment is just as good will help us to appreciate both sides of the positive spectrum. Second is social interaction. So for this specific research, I had the privilege of hosting a summer book club on the Asian American experience. And I was able to hear the unique experience of boarding students on how it was like to be an Asian or an Asian American in Western culture. And one of the most important things that came up was misunderstandings. I think it goes to show that because we value friendliness in terms of that big open smile, sometimes we create misunderstandings that just because someone is not smiling, that means that they're not engaged, which is not necessarily true because we come from different cultures where we perceive and express friendliness in different ways. And having that realization might help us to eliminate those misunderstandings. The last is our school community. So this was very much a coincidence, but in my Women in Lit class, 3 students shared a poem on how they felt misunderstood as introverted students. And the story of the poem was basically that a lot of teachers looked at them and being unengaged in the class because they weren't willing to speak up, or students saw them as shy or quiet, which was not necessarily true. They just had a preference of being more introverted than extroverted. And this led to a very interesting conversation in class of how in Western culture, we always view extroversion as good and introversion as bad. And in class environments, that's really important on how teachers grades the engagement level of a student. And so Ms. Falk, our teacher, was talking about how she was trying to work on evaluating students, not on their extroversion, but on different ways they can express their engagement. So with this data that I gathered from this research, I have two research that's going on. One is from my honors research independent class. I'm looking at different ways that culture might influence how we socially interact in social media, which is such a huge platform for us communicating with people from all different parts of the world. I think it'll be really interesting to look at the different connotations of words, expressions, and picture depictions that might be present in social media. The second is a cross study comparing the results of this study to the results of the same study in another school. And one school I'm looking at right now is Phillips Academy in Massachusetts. They have a very different demographic context than Hawaii. So it'll be interesting to see if Hawaii's diversity plays a role in the data that you saw today. Lastly, before I end this research presentation, I want to thank Papa Jack and his family for encouraging students to take on the opportunity to do summer research. I would also like to thank Dr. Chan and Ms. Koktu for being my mentor for the research process. I would like to thank Dr. Lei for helping me get the approval to have human participants for this survey. I would like to thank Mr. Heiler, Mr. Chung, and Ms. Kim for reading over my research proposal and giving feedbacks. I would like to thank my parents for their support. I would also like to thank Gina Wang and Athena Mori for sharing their Asian American and Asian experience here in the United States. And lastly, I would like to thank Ia Gard, Elise Stanko, Izzy Suchiori, and Lockley McElroy for reviewing my presentation and slides. That's all. Thank you.